Well, welcome back to the Rainbow Studio and this edition of Appalling Twistianity. I am Yada, and this is the Wookiee here, and we're going to jump back into Paul's letter to the Galatians. It is the first letter written in the beginning of Christianity. Yeah, those who believe that Matthew was the first book and that it's all organized as it was decreed by God have been played for fools. The first book of the Christian New Testament, as in the order that it was written, was Galatians. It was written in 52 CE. At the time, there was no Jesus. He was invented for this letter. Paul pursued him in his next 14 letters. In fact, Paul's 14 letters became the first 14 books of the Christian New Testament. It wasn't until 10 years after Paul's last letter, that to Timothy, where he admitted that he was all alone and everyone had rejected him, for good reason, by the way. It was 10 years after the fact that the book of Mark was written. 5 years after that, Luke and Acts, they were both written by non-eyewitnesses. They were both written by men who weren't even in proximity to anyone. They weren't even secondary witnesses. They were never in proximity to anybody who had actually witnessed any of the events that took place in 33 CE. And Luke is heavily plagiarized from Mark. And it wouldn't be, so they were written in 75 to 80 CE in likely Rome. And then Matthew and John were both written by misnomers. We have no idea who the original author was. We think one was written in Rome and the other one probably in Ephesus, a very long way away. 3 generations removed from the facts. Matthew is 100% plagiarism, comes from 3 sources: Mark, Luke, and the Ebonim, the Ebonites. And John is who knows what, but it was also written between 95 and 100 CE in Ephesus, certainly not by somebody who had spent any time around Dode, as he is the actual Messiah who fulfilled the events in 33 CE. The Christian New Testament is really just a pile of rubbish. But proving it and saying it are 2 different things, so we are proving it in this program. Paul's run-on sentence as he was establishing Christianity, the religion his way, read, "As we have said before." And no, this is the first letter. There was no said before, and there was no we. Paul was absolutely alone at this point. He was a lone wolf, literally a lone wolf, because he was a Benjamite. As we have stated before, that is a lie twice over. No we and no stated before. And even just now, okay, well, you can get that one right. I'll give you a credit for that one. You are stating it just now also. So why would you have as previously stated, just now, also? Why don't you say what you're going to say? I mean, why do you have to have 4 introductory concepts? Although perhaps altogether through, why not? I mean, it's terrible writing. I say, okay, not God says, I say. This is the basis of Christianity, but Paul say. I say. And who's I? He's a piece of crap. He was a failed rabbi. He was a sexual pervert by his own admission. He admitted he was demon possessed. He is guilty of every possible rational fallacy. He couldn't keep his own life history accurate, messed up everything else. He never once quoted the character that became gospel Jesus, never once. Every citation from Yahweh to prove his point, he misappropriated, twisted, perverted, and misrepresented in every possible way. He is literally a piece of shit. And yet you want to believe, but I say, no. I say that he's an idiot. So as we have said before, lie, just now, also, I say.
You just got to believe.
2.5 billion people believe the religion that this man conceived with these stupid letters. As we have said before, even just now, also I say, if someone delivers a evangelizo, a gospel, a helpful messenger, communicates a useful message, it's from you to be good, beneficial, and angelo, which is either message or messenger. Take of that which you will. To you, similar or contrary to, in opposition with, or just positioned alongside, para, which means close to, besides, approximately the same, near, beyond, or greater than, in the opinion of some, even associated with. So para is not much of a contrast. It is much more of a comparison. So if someone presents a message that is somewhat similar, positioned alongside that which you received, and that would be, he's talking about what he received from whom, Paul? Not from God.
From himself.
From himself. Can't be from Jesus, because Jesus didn't exist yet. Jesus never talked to, even gospel Jesus never ventured to Galatia. So it's from himself. You received, you bought in, you associated with, you related to, which, by the way, happens to be another lie because they rejected him. He made that clear in his previous statement. It shall be, it will, this is written as I wish or command, it shall exist as. The present tense means that this state currently exists and that it will continue for an undisclosed period. The active voice means that the subject, Paulos, who is the speaker, is actively engaged in bringing about the curse. And the imperative mood serves as either a command or an expression of the speaker's desire, or both. I want a curse to exist, and I demand that a curse exists with dreadful consequences. Galatians 1:9. So Paul is putting everyone on notice that he is the God of his religion, and he will not tolerate a rival. He would remain vengeful, and dreadful results would follow for anyone that would dare say that he was a piece of shit. Cursing the Jews, no problem. But if the Jews responded to him, they were demonic. He would not prevail through evidence and reason. No, there was no differentiation here, was there? There was no, listen, I know I presented a message to you that I cited out of the Torah, and you had already heard, or somebody else presented a message to you that was presented out of a different book of the Torah or from a prophet, and their interpretation was slightly different than mine. And let me explain that I base my definition on an explanation on these words conveyed in this context this way, and they chose to interpret those words differently. And so I'm going to tell you that both ways have some merit, but the reason I think my interpretation makes more sense is when you look at the etymological history of these words, and you view them in this context, and you consider them with what else God conveyed throughout the Torah and prophets, this interpretation makes more sense than the other one. But it isn't a curse. It's just that we have a difference here in our conclusions regarding this evidence, but I'm taking the time to explain to you how that difference is manifest, and then you can make a reasoned decision as to what you choose to accept. Did he say any of that? No. He just said, I had a evangelizo, a good or beneficial message or messenger, and somebody now has might be very similar, might be quite different, but alongside mine, somebody else came up with one, and because they challenged mine, even if they were the same, the fact that they said it versus I said it, a curse now exists. Not going to tell you what the argument was over. Not going to tell you where we disagreed. I'm not going to even tell you what I told you. Nor am I going to express what they said in contrary to what I told you. I'm just going to tell you that if anyone conveys a message that whether it's different than mine or exactly the same as mine, no matter how good it is, a curse exists because it's not from me, myself, and I. That is the only rational deduction from this. And I'm here to tell you, that's damning.
It's like suing somebody for criticizing you. Like
yes.
The president does.
Yeah, but this is the exact approach that Donald Trump has.
Yeah.
That if anybody isn't wholeheartedly saying, oh, Trump, winner, winner, chicken dinner, then they're scum. And if you even take a breath of air and say, you know, I didn't applaud at the right moment there, I wasn't quick enough in my standing ovation, you know, you are chicken liver with Donald Trump. That's the same thing here.
Yep.
No reason. The total confabulation. There's no correlation between what he said and reality. But what he has done here is to say that there is a difference of opinion. I have one, somebody else has another. I'm not going to identify who the others are. I'm not going to tell you what my opinion was. I'm not going to tell you what their opinion was. I'm just telling you that there's a difference of opinion, and I'm the one conveying one of the two opinions, and there's a difference of opinion, then a curse exists. That is what he just said. And there are 2.2 or 2.5 billion morons that adhere to this nincompoop's religion. It's obviously easy to fool most of the people most of the time. So this is Paul's first letter. So, as we have said before, is only potentially a reference to the previous sentence. But does he have a frog in his pocket? Something he makes clear by way of arti, simultaneously and immediately thereafter. As a result, since Paulos is writing exclusively under his own chosen name, no longer under his given name, Shaul, we must consider what he's trying to accomplish by using we, then ponder why he felt it was necessary to transition back to I in the same sentence. Who were his partners? And why at times did he include some and exclude them? He doesn't tell you, does he? Now, it is revealing, therefore, that Galatians 1:6 begins, I am amazed, first person singular, present tense, but then transition to we delivered, first person plural, past tense, in Galatians 1:8, when ranting about the same issue that they rejected him. Paul's recent visit to Galatia was with Barnabas, according to Acts, which, by the way, contradicts Paul's letters, perhaps accounting for the prior and plural message delivery. But the short period between Jerusalem and that summit where he was brought in and said, are you full of it? And the time that his letter was dictated, Barnabas and Shaul had a heated argument and had gone their separate ways. And according to the present singular perspective, well, that was all reflected over the course of a sentence without telling you who it was or what happened or why. I mean, I can tell you why. Paul was a asshole. At least that would be the case had Galatians 1:9 not included we and I in immediate succession. Also, interesting, Shaul will take a mean-spirited swipe at Barnabas before this letter is through, just as he condemns Peter within it. All was not good within Christendom. As is the case with everything Paul writes, he never bothers to explain the nature of the argument. Ever. Not once. Ever. All this says is that I'm always right and everyone else is wrong, even if they come up with the same answer.
Sounds familiar.
As such, even if Shaul's opinions were right, and they're not, ever, without a basis in fact, this would not be helpful. Thus far, and indeed throughout Paul's letters, we will be exposed to Paul's opinions, but I, Paul, say, and we will be appraised of his attitude, but I, Paul, condemn, but nothing else. Other than omitting the accusative, contrary or in opposition to, adding preach without justification, replacing the verb euangelizo with the noun gospel, which has no basis other than it's God's spell. God would be a pagan god, and spell is a curse. And adding the pronoun at the end of the verse, the King James got most of this right, as we said before. And so I now, again, if any man preach other than gospel to you, then that ye have received, let him be accursed. There you go. Now, to make that seem quasi-literate, they had to write their own text that had considerable differences from what was actually written. Gospel and what we have preached, from exactly the same word, spelled exactly the same way. One can't be gospel, which is a made-up term that didn't even exist at the time. And the other one preached, which was also a made-up term, neither one of which were used. Their inspiration was obviously Jerome's Latin Vulgate, just as we have said before. So let me say again, if anyone has euangeliverete to you other than that which you have received, let him be anathema. The New Living Translation, which is new, but not living and not a translation, actually a paraphrase, wrote, I say again what we have said before. If anyone preaches any other good news other than the one you welcomed, let that person be cursed. All three versions were unable to translate para, meaning close, but yet somehow in opposition. Appropriately when it was used in conjunction with their gospel and good news. But by changing paralambano to welcomed, the New Living Translation was once again the least accurate. Now, before we move on, I want to underscore a deficiency associated with the previous statements and indeed with all of Shaul's letters. For this to be an effective warning, for it to be instructive and useful, we must know what Paul told the Galatians, and we don't. And also know how his preaching, if we want to use that term, differed from those he was cursing. And why did they deserve a curse? Did they do something that God said is deserving of a curse? Or just something Paul said was deserving of a curse? Yeah, that would be the answer. We don't have a face cam here for Richard, or you would see him go.
It's so obvious.
Yes. With this information, or without this information, I'd say speculation reigns supreme, and false interpretations are far too readily developed, both of which are Paul's fault in their entirety. He was a crappy communicator. Well, maybe he was. That was his agenda. He wanted to communicate crap. As it stands, all we have is that anyone who delivers a message which differs in any way from Paul's should be cursed, all of which sounds hauntingly similar to Allah's response in the Quran's never-ending argument. And while that was designed to censure debate, and while it was it has kept most critics at bay because they don't want to have Allah threaten to burn their britches in hell, by repeating this, Paul has tipped his hand. He has said that his skin and doctrine are so thin that neither can tolerate criticism. That is a sign of insecurity. When I made the decision to write my amplified translations in the form I did throughout the 35 books of the Yada Yada series, 25,000 pages of information, I decided to do exactly the opposite. I decided to tell you everything you could possibly know. I gave you the full definition of every word and then provided the transliteration of the generic form of that word that you can put into any search engine and validate that translation on your own. And if a word was unique or there was a question as to what it might mean, I'd write a paragraph about it and said, here's your options. I've chosen this option for the following reasons. And then I would make connections between what was said in this particular case, always quoting the word of God. So our strategy was 100% different. I wrote all of my books saying, this is what God said. This is what this means and how it applies to your life. Paul never once did that. He only quoted inaccurately Yahweh without ever naming him or ever crediting him for the statement to justify something Paul had said. And then he had to misappropriate what Yahweh actually said. My goal was, rather than create as inaccurate a rendering of God's testimony as was possible, and to always pull it out of context, to always provide the opposite intent, my goal was to do exactly the opposite of that. And it was never to prove my agenda. It was always start with what God said, present it as accurately and completely as possible, always do so in context, and then deduce conclusions based upon what he said. Paul took exactly the opposite approach. Paul say, I validate it by taking a snippet of what God said out of context and misrepresenting it. They are the opposite approach. And if you want to trust Paul over what I have done, you're an idiot. Yadayada.com. It's all there for you. Those who cannot defend their message attack those who are critical of it. In politics, this strategy is known as killing the messenger. Now, introduction aside, here's a quick review of Shaul's second and third sentences. I marvel and I am amazed, even astonished, that in this way, how quickly and in haste you changed, deserting and becoming disloyal apostates, traitors away from your calling in the name of Charis, the cute little naked goddesses, to a different healing message and beneficial messenger, which does not exist differently, if not hypothetically, negated because perhaps some are stirring you up, confusing you, and also proposing to change the healing messenger and the good message and pervert the beneficial message of Christu, who, by the way, did not exist. There was no Christu in first century Yahudah or until centuries thereafter. And then it was only backdrafted to pretend that there was somebody named Mr. Christu or Christos or Christone. Never existed. Complete misnomer. And based upon a nothing prophecy that was actually delivered by the actual Messiah and spoke of what he himself was going to do, none of which the imaginary Christu actually did. No reference to a Christu anywhere in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. So you can't have a Mr. Christu as a fulfillment of prophecy or having anything to do with the Old Testament. If you want to make up your lies and create a myth of Iusu Christu and equate him to Dionysus and Zeus, have at it. You can do that, but to attribute them to Yahweh, his Torah and prophets, and to say that he spoke of them and that they are a god and that they are associated with the God who scribed the Torah and prophets, inspired them, you can't do that without presenting yourself as a complete fraud. And that's what he did. So it says, then, but to the contrary, if we or a messenger out of heaven conveys a healing messenger or beneficial message to you, which is approximately the same or contrary to, or even positioned alongside what we have delivered as a beneficial messenger or announced as a healing message to you, then a curse with dreadful consequences exists. It means that somebody speaking directly out of heaven, Yahweh, for example, whom he doesn't know by name, and they were to say something that is different than what Paul said, then there would be a curse on Yahweh placed by Paul.
Let me know how that works out.
Yeah, tell me how that works out for you. I can tell you how that works out for you. There's a place for that. And it's named after, that's the, Shaul got, he got naming rights because it's called Sheol, written exactly the same way in the Hebrew text. Maybe there's a message in that. As we have said already, and just now, immediately thereafter, repeatedly, I say, if under the conditions someone delivers a helpful messenger or communicates a useful message to you, similar to or contrary to, in opposition with, or just positioned alongside, I know you think I'm repeating myself, but this is what he wrote. No matter if it is close to or greater than that which you received, it shall be, and in fact, I command and want it to exist as a curse with a dreadful consequence. That's 1:9 after 1:8. Yes, he repeated himself. Why? If you're going to take that many words, why wouldn't you actually present what the difference was? Why wouldn't you name who the rivals were? Why wouldn't you explain why it was important that one message was valid and the other wasn't? Why wouldn't you validate your approach on something that Yahweh had said? Like in the Torah, Yahweh says that that the covenant is essential and that it delivers these benefits and it requires these acceptances from us.
He can't explain his own.
No, because what he is creating is a religious construct that can only be believed through faith and cannot ever be proven by fact. And in fact, Jesus Christ, his construct, is nothing but a product of identity theft. He never existed. So, are you confused or sickened? Angry or cursed? Now, living life to its fullest in the loving embrace of the most wonderful woman I have ever met, sitting in my study in America's paradise, overlooking the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea in the U.S. Virgin Islands, while translating Yahweh's Torah and prophets, including my King song, I am proof positive that the only thing Paul cursed was himself and those he beguiled. But don't take my word for it. Read the 35 books, all presented free at yada.com. There's 5 devoted to ripping Paul to shreds very effectively. All I had to do is report what Paul said and approach what Paul said historically, logically, and in comparison to what Yahweh said. And when he quotes something from God whose name he never mentions to prove a point that he's trying to make, and he misquotes him, proof. Poof. And I do that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So as we move to the next statement, while the interrogative required to frame the question presented in most English translations does not actually appear in the Greek text, it is implied because Paul is asking us to choose, but he didn't know how to write a question. These questions, however, are rather odd, considering that Paul has pitted his message against God. He said that the Torah was pornography in his opening statement. He said that the whole purpose of his caricature, Iusus Christou, was to rip us away from that Torah. So yeah, that's his competition, is God, who is the same God that he says is inspiring him and has appointed him to be the mighty apostle to the world. That would be pretty stupid, wouldn't it, for God to say, yeah, I'm going to appoint somebody to speak to the world for me. And what they're going to say is that what I've written is pornography. It's trash. It cannot save. And that he's going to create a religion using a misnomer whose job it is to rip you away from everything that I have previously said is true. But if you're a Christian, that is your scenario. Live with it. Also, the first is this first approach is advanced through a very peculiar verb. It's one that runs the gamut from perplexing to inappropriate, from conceited to bewildering, but Paul wasn't the greatest wordsmith. If I may, since the writing quality is so poor, let's begin with Nestle Allen's McReynolds interlinear. Now for men I persuade, or the God. Now for men I persuade, or the God. Or I seek men to please. If still men, I was pleasing of Christ, slave, not I was.
Huh? I've got a headache.
I'll read that again. This is the most scholastic of all possible renderings. It's literal from the Nestle Allen's 27th edition, which is a composite text of manuscripts. Unfortunately, they never adjusted their text to the 69 pre-Constantine manuscripts, because, well, there's 300,000 known variances between those and the text that they have delivered themselves. But and they don't tell you how many differences there are, and the fact that there's twice as many differences as there are actually words in the New Testament. But they don't want you to know any of that. But nonetheless, that is the most scholastic approach you can take is, now for men I persuade, or the God. Or I seek men to please. If still men, I was pleasing of Christ, who, by the way, didn't exist. Slave not I was. Well, that's clear as mud. So then amplified and even more literal. And I have done this throughout every verse that is presented, because I have access to the 69 first, second, and third century manuscripts, even the early 4th century manuscripts, and therefore can render this exactly as it was testified to in the manuscripts prior to Constantine and Eusebius writing their own text the way that they saw fit. And therefore it reads, for, which is gar, because, currently, arti, or simultaneous, just now. Men I persuade. Now, they want to turn this into a question, because it's the only way it works is as a question, but it does not actually appear in the text. It just reads, for currently, men I persuade. This was Pitho. I presently, actively, and actually use words to win the favor of. I seduce, mislead, coax, convince, appease, and placate, introducing someone through words to believe so that they strive to please me by tranquilizing them, would be a complete definition of the word in the tense that it was written. And look it up yourself. Or, alternatively, the God. Or, by the way, God didn't have a name. You know, all gods have a name. Dionysus had a name. Amen-Ra had a name. Zeus had a name. Jupiter had a name. All the gods had a name. Why doesn't Paul's God have a name? Poor Paul God doesn't have a name. Paul's got two names, Shaul and Paul.
In Paul's words, he is God.
Well, yeah, well, of course. But poor Pauline God doesn't have a name. Or the God, or, and do I does not exist. Or I seek to please and accommodate men. I oblige men, humans. Yet nevertheless, I don't know, how do you get there? Nevertheless from there. But yet nevertheless, if, boy, the conditional clauses here are just would choke a cow. Yet nevertheless, if men, I was pleasing and accommodating, slave of Christu. Certainly not was me.
This is where they got the speaking style of Yoda from Star Wars.
You're going to demean Yoda this way?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So the initial verb, pitho, was written in the first person singular, present active indicative, which not only means that Paulos is again operating on his own, but also that the opening sentence literally reads, because currently men, I presently, actively, and actually use words to win the favor of. I seduce, I mislead, coax, appease, and placate. Inducing belief through words, pleasing to me while tranquilizing them. Or the God. So regardless of which option we choose, this question poses a series of rather serious problems. Well, only a problem if you're a Twistian. I'm not, so it's not a problem for me. It's an opportunity for me. First, the transition from we as the sources of the lone acceptable message, which was never, by the way, articulated, but it was associated with those cute little girls, and they were adorable. The Cherish, which are rendered in the Latin as gratia, and became the graces and grace in English. They're little, they're party hardy animals. They were the cutest little girls in both the Roman and in the Greek religion. They were always naked, and they were always up to, well, mischief if you're into Christendom's standards of sexual behavior, because they were encouraging all manner of sexuality and party hardy. Romans loved them, and the Greeks loved them because, that fit right up into their alley. So the Cherries and the Gratia were very popular. And this was the gospel of the Gratia, the gospel according to those cute little girls. Now, having read a fair amount of Greek and Roman mythology, it's a funny thing. The Gratia and the Graces, they were cute. I had a good time. They didn't have a gospel. They didn't have a message. They don't have a message. They traded on emotional responses and were fixated on things that were about skin deep,
just like the religious do.
Yeah, they were not into a gospel. They were not into delivering a message. They were their message. So, rather than partnering with men, as we might imply, is Paul opposing men in some sort of grand debate? Or rather than partnering with God, as we might also suggest, is Paul actually arguing against him? Those are your options. And while Paul's personal confessions, his side here, his positions on his approach affirm that, well, if you read to the bitter end, he has a partner. He said there was a messenger, a gelos. He used the Greek, a messenger. This would be like a malak. Hasatan is a malak. He said there was a malak from Satan that controlled him. That's his partner. End of 2 Corinthians, if you want to verify that fact. There is a hint of delusional arrogance here in this transition, just a hint back to I, because no matter how we translate pitho, Paul is implying that his rhetoric and reason are sublime. It is as if he wants us to believe that he was so much smarter than everyone else, that he could take on God and men single-handedly, one hand tied behind his back, half a tongue working. Second, winning favor along with, I should say, persuade and convince. So winning favor along with persuade and convince is the best we can do with pitho. Every other connotation makes this question, or pretense of a question, substantially worse, because it would read, I presently, actively, and actually seduce, mislead, coax, appease, and placate men. Or God. Take your pick. Third, in spite of what the religious zealots have been led to believe, we are not called to win the favor of men. Not once, not ever, by God. He does not want us to win the favor of men. Men can earn the favor of God, but we are not called to win the favor of men. If your goal is to have men favor you and to like you, then I can assure you, you're not speaking for God. Ever. You want to know the fastest way to have men disavow you? Speak for Yahweh. Guarantee it happens 100% of the time. There really isn't an exception to that. Look at every one of his prophets. Look at all the key players in his story. 100% of the time, always the same. If you're speaking for God, you are not winning the favor of men. It is always the opposite. We're not even called to persuade and convince men. No. We are called to know what Yahweh said, to understand it, and then once we know it and understand it, to share it. What people do with it is completely up to them. And the notion of persuading and convincing God, apart from Paul's letters, that would be nonsensical. I've had a few arguments with God. I've said, God, you're making this really hard. Could we have this? Could we have a little bit easier than it is? And he says, nope. So you want to have an argument with God? You're going to get a lot of nope. No. And then after a while, you grow up and you say, oh, now I realize why it's hard. It has to be hard. If it wasn't hard, idiots like this would appear in heaven, and then heaven would be filled with idiots like this, and then heaven would be like hell. So it can't be easy. You've got to have the want to. You've got to have a desire to pay attention to what God says. You've got to have your mind working. You've got to think it through. You've got to come to reasoned deductions and then act upon that and be consistent with it. So God's not trying to make it easy in this case. So as I say, I remember one of the last times a couple times that I had an argument with God, I had written years ago, 22 years ago, a book called Prophet of Doom. And it's the only book that I had not gone back and edited as I learned more over time. And so I didn't want to go back and edit that book because, it's about Muhammad, who was a pedophile and rapist and mass murderer and demonic piece of crap. And his non-God, who was modeled after Satan. And so it's really dark. And it's like, you have to go for every day that you're in a book like that, you have to trounce into hell and wallow in the mud with these monkeys. And I just didn't enjoy it. And I was asked to do it. I did it. I spent then 2-3 years of my life in writing it and then promoting it and radio shows. It had a tremendous purpose because as I would speak out against it, lots of people would listen to what I had to say about Yahweh, and it brought in most of the covenant family members that are with us today. But it was not fun. So on the morning of October 7th, 23, as Muslims were not marching in, they were scurrying in on their tinny rompers into Israel, most of them with garden tools. I knew I was the only person in the world that knew what was happening, why it was happening, and what the proper response would be. And I knew that it was in Prophet of Doom, but I wasn't comfortable promoting Prophet of Doom at the time because of the fact that, it was written 23 years earlier when I knew a tiny fraction of 1% of what I know now. And therefore, I knew that I needed to rewrite it to be that tool. And I knew that was going to take another year of my time, and it's not fun when translating Yahweh's testimony is fun. So I said, come on, God, we're having a great time. We're writing Coming Home Volume 3, learning a lot, great stuff. I know I'm watching this stuff. I know that's where the answer is. I know I haven't updated it in a very long time, but, you don't want me to go back there, do you? Simple answer. I've taken care of you. Now you take care of my people. Well, this is what happens if you try to negotiate with God. He wins every argument. We have fun. Well, I think it's fun, but one does not convince God. God knows what's up. He knows what's best. You either do what is right or you don't. And if you don't, then you are not going to convince God that you're right. I can assure you of that. So the notion of persuading and convincing God that Paul has written about is absolute nonsense. It is God's job to convince us that he is trustworthy and reliable and that he inspired the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, not our job to try to convince him that we have something worthy to add or to say. And even then, Yahweh is not interested in winning our favor or in persuading us. God lies outside of the, he lays out the opportunity and the conditions to form a relationship with him. He proves that we can trust him. He invites us to get to know him, and then working with his son, he made it possible. He enabled those promises by fulfilling Pesach, Matzah, and Makodim, for example. And that's really as far as God goes. Rest is up to you. Therefore, if we render Pitho as favorably as possible, if the answer to the question is men, Paul's approach is ungodly. And if the answer is God, then Paul's arrogance is in league with Satan. Rational. That's the only two informed rational deductions that can be made from that text. And both of them mean that you need to throw out everything in Christianity, because this is the opening salvo. This is the foundation of the religion of Christianity. It's not based on the birth of a baby God. There was no baby God. That is the good news. When any of Pitho's alternative definitions are considered, Paul becomes the Lord of deceit. Yahweh called him the son of evil. The devil, Pitho, seduces, misleads, coaxes, appeases, and placates. That is why Yahweh called Shaul the father of lies. As you might suspect, Pitho is almost exclusively Pauline. It is used in Paul's letters and attributed to him throughout Acts. One of the few times that is found in association with the gospel Jesus that would emerge, 2.5 decades after this letter. The book of Matthew, which was written around 100 CE and heavily edited by Eusebius in the 4th century, shows him translated using it to convey the religious mindset of the opposition by writing the chief priests and the elders, Pitho, the multitude. So they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Iusus. Shortly thereafter, in Matthew 28:14, and now in a political setting, the impostor writing under the pseudonym Master, Matthew is translated using Pitho again to say, and if this comes to the governor's ears, he will Pitho him. So it's presented there as a religious term and a political term in opposition to gospel Jesus. Luke, who was Paul's attaché, his propagandist and his spiritual healer, in his hearsay account translates gospel Jesus using, I use gospel Jesus because there is no real Jesus. So if I'm going to reference the one that's now presented in the Gospels, what am I going to call him other than gospel Jesus? Translates gospel Jesus, the impostor, using Pitho twice, but neither translation is credible in that Luke wasn't an eyewitness, and even in the fables written of him, the mythical misnomer never spoke Greek. So he couldn't have used the word. Now, I understand that religious individuals do not see any issue with men persuading other men on behalf of their God. but that is because they have been deceived into believing that it is their God's will that we win souls for them. They see conversion to the religion as a favorable event, as something that bolsters their faith. They not only send out evangelists to persuade people into believing as they do, the church has used the threat of violence for eons to convert the masses, doing so for centuries. But not only is Paul's message opposed to God's message, winning souls is not God's style. He's trying to push them away. He doesn't want most people anywhere near him. Yahweh is only interested in those who are interested with him. And all he wants from us is to understand who he is, what he's offering, and what he expects in return. And yet there isn't 1 in a million people that can answer any one of those 3 questions. That way we can choose, once we know the answer to those 3 questions, of our own volition, to get to know him, to ignore him, to reject him. With God, it's all about free will. Now, these things known, there is no way to overemphasize the consequence of this question, or pretense of a question. No matter the answer, it proves that Paul did not speak for God. It also demonstrates that his use of we did not include God. In fact, included no one other than an imaginary friend to make it sound like he was part of a large movement, but he wasn't. It does not get better from here. But after posing a non-question where both options have horrendous ramifications, indeed religious implications, Shaul spends his pretense of a question posing it a different way. And yet this only makes it worse, because we ought not try to accommodate or please men. Yahweh doesn't. No, didn't. In fact, God's approach is just the opposite. He is resolutely intolerant. He does not accommodate the views of the vast preponderance of people. He is displeased with humanity and says so overtly. While it is Yahweh's desire for us to get to know him, he only accommodates the few who do. Also problematic. With the juxtaposition of the first and second E, which is or, we cannot isolate Paul seeking to please men from the possibility that he is attempting to accommodate God. The first option is disingenuous and pathetic, while the second is ludicrous. Not only were these questions left unanswered, which is typical Pauline style, which leaves one wondering why they were even posed. Why would you do that? You're going to say there was a difference in opinion on one message versus another. You're going to use a bogus term for message. And then you're going to say that if any message differs or even is similar from mine, but is presented by somebody else, even if they came from heaven, that they're cursed. And you're not going to explain what the differences were. And then you're going to say, ask a potential question, am I trying to seduce God or men? And you won't even answer that question. Why pose these hypotheticals? They're just left unanswered. Why were they posed? They were followed by eti, nevertheless, and I, if, strongly suggesting that Paul actually wanted us to think that he was capable of sparring with God. Further, aresco, the next verb that Paul deploys, is not a cerebral concept, but instead speaks of exciting and enticing emotions. And the object this time is choristo, indicating that God, rather than being predictable and dependable, can be swayed by an emotional appeal. Well, Yahweh has an emotional component to his nature. Everything that we know about God affirms that he values an informed and rational response over misdirected feelings. being steadfast to him is exceedingly important. Now, Paul routinely infers that he died to become Christ. Okay, then how is he writing this? And what good is his death? Why would you have to die to become one with your God, unless your God is death? Certainly, then he says, which is what of Christu, certainly not was me. Now, who knows what that means, but that's what he wrote. However, if one sees Paul's Iusu Christu as the new and mythological caricature upon which Pauline religions was contrived, then the author of this letter is the living embodiment of the Christian Jesus Christ. Paul is to Jesus Christ as Muhammad was to Allah. They're one. They are the same. If you know one, unfortunately, you know the other. If you like one, well, then you'll like the other, but that doesn't say much for you. If we were to dispense with the dubious connections and evaluate Paul's rhetoric as if it were presented in a debate, he'd flunk. It couldn't pass that test either. Shaul deployed a non sequitur. The initial question was not answered by his hypothetical, and there was no quid pro quo between accommodating man and serving his Christu. Moreover, how is it that Paul, who fashions himself as one of those who liberated the faithful from the bondage of the Torah, is now positioning himself as a slave, which he did? And not just anybody's slave. He is now in servitude to the same Christu whose death supposedly freed everyone from slavery. So this has become a litany of contradictions. And the fact remains, only an egomaniac would suggest that someone might wonder whether or not a man was persuading God. And that is especially troubling, since the opening stanza of this letter affirms that Paul was not effectively persuading and convincing men. Beyond this, perhaps we can deduce that Paul's intent was to convince his audience by displaying hostility towards the Galatians, which he did at large. When you have a blanket indictment and you're condemning all people for rejecting you, maybe the finger ought to come the other way as opposed to out there. He never figured that part out, because he wrote the same letter to the Thessalonians and wrote the same letter to the Corinthians. All three times he was there, he preached his little brains out, or whatever it was that he was preaching from, and came back and wrote a scathing letter and said, "Why did you reject me? You all turned against me," just as he did here to the Galatians. Anyway, he was displaying hostility towards them at large, as well as against all other messengers or messages. That was, he was trying to demonstrate without proving it, but was he there to please God and not men? And if he was there to please men, why did they were also displeased with him? And if he was trying to please God, why didn't he quote him? Why didn't he name him? But nothing, and why would you take umbrage with it? In other words, if you're speaking for Yahweh and everybody rejects it, which is natural, why would you take umbrage? Why would you have a tizzy fit and say that any message, even from heaven, that differs from mine is a curse? Speak for Yahweh. Yahweh's got big shoulders. They want to reject Yahweh. That's their choice. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting Yahweh. So let it be. It will be. Nothing displeases God more than denouncing and discarding his testimony, which is what Paul completely did. Now, this is a serious problem for thoughtful and rational individuals. When Paul was not focusing on himself, he was focused on presenting an errant characterization of replacement Jesus. Neither perspective has merit. Even gospel Jesus said that people should focus on the Father and not on him. But since Paul is in opposition to Yahweh and his Torah, that simply wasn't possible. Now, I'm keenly aware that there is a limit to the amount of criticism that an audience will endure. And while gospel Jesus differed from Yahweh and called the faithful to love their enemies, we are not encouraged by God to expose and condemn his foes and those of his people, which is why questioning Paul is so essential. So he wants us to do this. This is what God does routinely. He points out the foibles of religious and political mantras so that we're not lured by them, and God wants us to do that. I mean, the first thing that God asked me to do when we first met 25 years ago is to expose and condemn Allah, Muhammad, and Islam, which I did. And then his next request is do the same for Paul and Jesus, which I did. There's 10 books now available on those subjects, all free at yada.com. So to be appropriate, our criticisms need to be bolstered by evidence and reason. They need to be consistent with God's testimony, and they should be focused on an individual, an institution, or a very specific message. We can't play the anecdotal game. Well, I know a Christian that was a good guy, or I know a Muslim that was a bad guy, so the religion is good or bad based upon an anecdotal evidence. You want to play anecdotal evidence, go away, because you are a waste of breath. It's got to be focused on an individual responsible for disseminating a message, or the institution in which embodies it, or the specific message itself, like that of the Quran, the New Testament, the Zohar, the Talmud. That's fair game. So is Akiba, Paul, Peter, Muhammad. In Paul's case, his blanket dismissal of an entire province and nation is not appropriate, nor is his criticism without justification. And Paul seldom provides any under any circumstances. He condemns Peter without even giving a reason. He condemns John of nothing more than having a different evangelion than his. So this letter opened similarly to what we read earlier from Romans 7 and that diatribe with universal condemnation. Generic statements like that seldom have any value. When you say, all Greeks are overweight. No, some are, some aren't. And some people who are Greek are not Greek are. Some are not. It's generalities like that never are even worth stating. So while it's appropriate to constructively criticize religious documents and institutions, it is not appropriate to rail against their victims en masse unless they become promoters and perpetrators of a lie that is damning to God's people or God's message. And yet Paul is lashing out at everyone while undermining the entire community because he suspects everyone is his foe. He's paranoid, including from heaven and down to earth. He feels compelled to cut them all down. So in this regard, his tone will evolve from condescending to vicious and will become stunningly uncivilized and uncultured. And while I never find it appropriate, since Paul poses the question, his wholly antagonistic attitude towards men reveals the answer to the questions that he posed. In his mind, he was debating God. Moreover, the evidence will demonstrate Paul's rage was universally misplaced. Shaul's adversaries were leading the Galatians to Yahweh and to the Torah, while Shaul's were taking them for a ride in the opposite direction. Now, apart from the errant title Christ, my concern with the most influential translations is that they were neither consistent with the actual text, and they added and removed words. They added a plethora of terms to artificially elevate the writing quality and removed ones that they did not understand or didn't fit their religion. Well, Paul wrote, "For because currently or simultaneously men I presently persuade to win the favor of, seducing, misleading, and coaxing, even conniving and appeasing, placating, and alternatively the theos, God, or alternatively, by comparison and contrast, I desire to please and accommodate humans. Yet nevertheless, even regardless if men, I was obliging and accommodating, exciting them emotionally, a slave of Christu, certainly not was me." With that being what he wrote, the King James Version published, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I yet pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ." Now, while Christians no doubt see this as a rhetorical question, the deeper we dig into Paul's mantra and mindset, the more likely it becomes that Paul thought himself qualified to persuade God to change his plan of salvation. The Latin Vulgate, right? And this would be the Latin Vulgate rendered in English. "For am I now persuading men or God? Or am I seeking to please men? If I still were pleasing men, then I would not be a servant of Christi." Now, unlike the King James and the Vulgate, the New Living Translations reads beautifully. It's a shame Paul didn't write this eloquently. Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing men were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. Well, there is an extremely remote possibility that this may have been what he meant to say. It is absolutely not what he wrote. And should they have magically captured Paul's intent, we are incapable of winning the approval of God. That is the reason God conceived a plan whereby he did all that was required to make us acceptable. Next, we find Shaul professing that the message he was revealing was his own. And indeed it was. And Apollos wanted everyone the world over to recognize that the mantra, which would become known as the gospel, the fact that there's 4 gospels preceding Paul's letters, doesn't mean that's how they were conceived. It's Paul that conceived the concept of a gospel, and the first of them would not be written until 2.5, 3 decades after this letter that introduced the concept of gospel, and they were written by 2 of Paul's cronies. It was hypo-ego is the basis of it, by, under, and through me. Hyper-ego, by reason and force of me, because of, and controlled by me and my ego. But, therefore, however, I profess, not God, not Yahweh, not even Jesus, but therefore I profess and I reveal, I perceive and I tell, I provide the knowledge I have gained to make known. I recognize and declare to you, brothers. He doesn't have any brothers. They all hated him, remember? Of the beneficial messenger and the healing message. Brothers of the beneficial messenger or of the healing message? Is he out of his mind? Which they all rejected. And he just affirmed they rejected it. So there are no brothers of that message, which having been communicated advantageously by myself, ego, because it was not in accord with man. Galatians 1:11. This, of course, means that Paul was solely responsible for his gospel. He conceived it all by himself, and he alone was authorized to declare it. It's his gospel, after all. As such, Paul was solely responsible for the mythology which became Christianity. There is no one else to credit or to blame. If his proposal and individual revelations are not true, and they aren't, the religion he conceived is wholly unreliable. Christian clerics universally recognize and readily admit that Paul opposed the alleged disciples. The statement merely explains why. His message was his own, and he did not play well with others. Set into the context of debating God, this is an incriminating confession. But even if you were unaware of Paul's underhanded slap at his adversaries, both human and divine, it was either egregiously presumptuous for an outrageous or an outrageous confession, one of the two. We're dealing with presumptiveness or confessions. To write, genozo, I reveal, I provide. The euangelion, the beneficial messenger and the healing messenger. And I, euangelio, communicate it advantageously. Hypo, ego, by myself. It's confession. If Paul were somehow speaking for God, shouldn't he be touting Yahweh's words and not his own? Said another way, someone who is speaking for Yahweh knows that it's his message, Yahweh's message, that matters, not the one who delivers it. Had this been anything more than Paul claiming the world as his own, he would have done what he was doing, and he would do as what we are doing, which is to dissect every errant message, showing through evidence and reason where it's wrong. He claimed that the gospel was his own. So they don't have a gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. No, the gospel is Paul's. He invented the concept. He won't take any rivals, and he argued with God to create his version. And he then claimed that his message alone would stand, and anyone who had a different gospel than his was cursed. Paul should have delineated pertinent examples of his euangelion, which maybe differed from his own, but he didn't. But the only message Paulos has condemned is God's. He was ruthless towards the Torah, discrediting and discarding God's Torah. His enemy is God. His victims are known as Christians. The McReynolds interlinear reveals that the Nestle Allen text reads, I make known to you, brothers, the good message, having been told good message by me, that not it is by man. So that's saying I'm not a man. I was the one who told you the message, but it's not by man. I told you the message, but it's not by man. What does that make Paul? A wannabe God. In order to make those words appear credible, euangelion and evangelizo had to be rendered differently, even though their etymological basis is identical. But yet in the King James, they said, but I clarify, I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me, gospel of me, is not after man. Then why doesn't God have a gospel? Well, that's incriminating. The King James Version accurately asserted that Paul certified that the gospel which was preached was of me. In a rational world, this would have been sufficient to bury him. Jerome's blend of old Latin text was both less accurate and less convincing. The Latin Vulgate reads, "For I would have you understand, brothers, that the Evangelium, which has been evangelizatum by me, was not according to man." Then where is God's proof text on it? I've translated most of the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. I've analyzed God's words, his message. I don't find a gospel anywhere in it, nor do I find the cute little gratia or the charities. I find a Paul mentioned, and God says that he's the plague of death. But that's not helpful to Christians, is it? But never had ever informed. The New Living Translation ignored 6 of the 12 Greek words. And then they added 10 English words of their own choosing. If you can't convey the meaning of the words in the text, then don't pretend that it is a translation, okay? Just said we're writing a novel. Still inadequate to support their theology, they grossly misinterpreted and misrepresented and inconsistently translated evangelion. Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand the gospel message I preach is not based upon mere human reasoning. The use of mere implies that human reasoning was a contributing factor. And that suggests that Yahweh's message was incomplete or inadequate, and that he required the contribution of Shaul's considerable intellect. When you combine Paul's arrogant and incriminating statements with the Christian interpretation of them, you have the crime and the confession laid right at your feet. So why have so few people held Paul accountable and condemned his New Testament in the process? Now, what follows is the other half of Shaul's defense. He is saying that he was not influenced by any human agenda or institution, while implying that those who oppose him are in opposition to his God. Paul's approach and style are rabbinic, and it would be hard to find someone more opposed to God than they. Well, unless it is Muhammad, but that's a story for another series of books. So we are about to jump into another sentence, and we're over our hour time frame in this program. So I'm going to bid you adieu for today. We will return to this message, hopefully tomorrow or the following day. We have some very blustery weather outside, so that's why we came down into the Rainbow Studio this morning, as opposed to continuing the Mizmor of Dode upstairs in the Ocean Studio. Maybe it'll taper down a little bit more as we go through the day, but when it gets that blustery, in 5 minutes time, we can come up with a rain squall, and that's pretty hard on our equipment. So we try to avoid that. Rich doesn't mind if I get wet, but the equipment has value. So
You're not going to melt.
I'm not going to melt. I'm not going to blow away. But the equipment, that's a different story. And so we're going to preserve the studio from the elements when we have the chance. So we came down here to this beautiful room in our Rainbow Studio, and that's why we're delivering this message today. I think we'll probably do a program in our library studio, which means we'll continue our exploration of the 89th Mizmor. I'm pretty comfortably 100 pages ahead of where we're reporting it, as I'm trying to, it's a very different process for me. I used to translate and contemplate to write books, and now I'm translating and contemplating to share these insights with you, contemporaneous with the learning process. And I happen to like it a lot better. Books are resulting from it, but I like it a lot better because As I discussed with Perry, who is visiting us here today and may stay for a good long time, is that, as he pointed out, teaching and learning are intertwined. And so when he said that, I said, the Hebrew word for to teach, and it's lamed. I said, you know what the Hebrew word is for to learn? It's lamed. So Yahweh had this figured out a long time ago. To teach, we learn. To learn, we can teach. And so these are related concepts. And the more we teach, the more we learn and come to really own the message that we're saying, but develop it and refine it. And so all of these things are interrelated. And I like this process of learning, literally as we're reading and sharing something with you, and then extrapolating upon it and going beyond it. It is constantly refining what we know and learning and improving. Even when we find that we've made a mistake in interpretation and there's a much more profound explanation, that whole process is so invigorating. It's so empowering, so enriching. And it pleases Yahweh no end that we can learn from our mistakes and grow from them. It proves that we're reliable and trustworthy. And so I'm very much enjoying that process, and we'll return to it upstairs. So I thank you for listening. I would, one of these days I would love to get back to, well, I wouldn't love to, but I'm willing to return to our assessment of Islam. I have written 4,200 pages of irrefutable evidence that Allah was not a god and Muhammad was not a prophet, and that Islam is a terrorist dogma, and that the religion exists for the purpose of human genocide. The problem with spending much time on it, devoting entire programs to it, is the thought police on Facebook and on YouTube won't allow you to convey the truth. The truth is never an alibi. So we have to be very careful in that regard. But we may do more programs as we go forward. And we also have to figure out, do we have 3 months left on this stage, or a year and 3 months left on it for the timing of the Shabuah harvest? We know that this Shabuah ushers in the time of Israel's trouble. So something's terrible is going to happen with the U.S. and Israel poised to attack Iran, which is now buttressed by China and Russia. So we know that it is the beginning of the time of Israel's troubles, 22 May of this year, 2026, on Shabuah. We just don't know if this is the Shabuah of the harvest. It could be next Shabuah. Those are the only two options. But I look forward to exploring that with you and continuing to take advantage of whatever time we have remaining. I thank you for listening. We look forward to being with you later today. Good day.
Hey there, thanks for tuning in. That was Fetch. Gotta run now. Catch y'all on our next podcast.